What if I told you that one of the most powerful countries in history shouldn't even exist? Not according to the generals, not according to the politicians, and certainly not according to the British Empire. Because in 1776, there was no United States of America, no Stars and Stripes, no White House, no Washington, D.C., no president, just 13 small colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, all controlled by the most powerful empire on Earth. If you had been alive back then, and someone told you these colonies would one day become the world's greatest superpower, you probably would have laughed. Because Britain didn't simply rule a country, it ruled an empire. Its navy dominated the oceans. Its army had defeated some of Europe's greatest powers. Its influence reached across continents. To challenge Britain wasn't just dangerous, it seemed impossible. So here's the real question. Why would anyone even try? Ironically, the answer begins with a victory, not a defeat. In 1763, Britain defeated France in the French and Indian War. The empire celebrated. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. Britain had become stronger than ever before. But behind the celebrations, there was a problem. Wars are expensive, really expensive. The British government had borrowed enormous amounts of money, and now someone had to pay the bill. London looked across the Atlantic at 13 colonies that were becoming wealthier every year. To British politicians, the solution seemed obvious. The colonies should help pay for the war that protected them. At first, that sounded perfectly reasonable. Until the taxes arrived. Taxes on paper, taxes on newspapers, taxes on legal documents, taxes on glass, taxes on paint, and finally, taxes on tea. The taxes themselves weren't crushing. Most people could afford them. But that wasn't the point. Imagine someone you've never voted for, living thousands of miles away, making decisions about your money, your business, your future, without ever asking your opinion. That's exactly how the colonists felt. They had no representatives in Parliament, no vote, no voice, yet every new law affected their daily lives. Soon, a sentence began appearing everywhere. On walls, in newspapers, inside taverns, even around family dinner tables. No taxation without representation. Just 4 simple words. But those 4 words carried an explosive idea. Maybe, just maybe, the king didn't have the right to rule them forever. Britain ignored the warning. It would become one of the greatest mistakes in the empire's history. Then, on one freezing night, everything changed. Boston Harbor, December 1773. 3 British ships floated quietly in the darkness, each one loaded with tea. Not gold, not silver, not weapons, just tea. To Britain, it was nothing more than cargo. To the colonists, it had become a symbol of control. A reminder that every cup of tea carried a tax they had never agreed to pay. As the city slept, dozens of men moved silently through the streets. Many disguised themselves to hide their identities. They climbed aboard the ships. The sailors watched, but no one was attacked. Nothing was stolen. Instead, the men walked straight to the cargo. Axes smashed into wooden chests. Tea poured across the decks. Then, one by one, the chests were thrown into the freezing black water. Splash. Another. Splash. Another. Splash.
For nearly 3 hours, the harbor echoed with the sound of breaking wood and crashing waves. By sunrise, more than 340 chests of tea had disappeared beneath the water. The British East India Company had lost a fortune.
But money wasn't what frightened Britain. It was the message. The colonies were no longer asking for change. They were openly challenging the authority of the British Crown. When news reached King George III, he didn't see a protest. He saw rebellion. His response was immediate. Boston Harbor was closed. Trade was cut off. British soldiers poured into the city. The king believed harsh punishment would force the colonies back into line. Instead, it did exactly the opposite. For the first time, the colonies stopped thinking like 13 separate communities. They started thinking like one people. And once that idea took hold, there was no stopping it. The next shot fired wouldn't hit a ship. It would ignite a revolution. By the spring of 1775, Britain had made one thing very clear. It would not tolerate rebellion. Thousands of British soldiers occupied Boston. Warships guarded the harbor. Every move made by the colonists was being watched. But something had already changed. The people were no longer afraid. Secret militias were training across the colonies. Farmers hid muskets inside barns. Blacksmiths forged ammunition in silence. Every village was preparing for something no one wanted to say out loud. War. Then, on the night of April 18th, 1775, everything happened at once. British commanders received intelligence that colonial militias were hiding weapons in the town of Concord. Their orders were simple. March to Concord, confiscate the weapons, arrest the rebel leaders if possible. End the rebellion before it truly begins. Nearly 700 British soldiers quietly marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness. It should have been an easy mission, but the colonies already had a warning system. Messengers raced through the countryside, knocking on doors, ringing church bells, waking entire towns. One of those messengers was Paul Revere. Galloping through the darkness, he warned that British troops were on the move. Within hours, lights appeared in windows across the countryside. Farmers grabbed their muskets. Blacksmiths left their workshops. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Teenagers stood beside old veterans. No one knew if they could win. But everyone understood one thing. If they surrendered now, they would never control their own future. Just before sunrise, the two sides finally met in Lexington. Only 77 colonial militiamen stood waiting. Across from them, nearly 700 trained British soldiers. The silence was unbearable. Neither side wanted to fire first. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then, a single gunshot echoed across the morning air. To this day, no one knows who fired it. A nervous British soldier? A frightened colonist? Someone hiding in the distance? History still doesn't have the answer. But that one shot changed the world forever. Within seconds, the silence exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted. Smoke filled the air. Men fell to the ground. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The British pushed on toward Concord, but they had made one critical mistake. They expected to fight an army. Instead, they were fighting an entire population. The colonists knew every road, every bridge, every forest, every stone wall. As British troops marched back toward Boston, gunfire came from every direction. Behind trees, behind fences, from farmhouse windows, from rocky hillsides. The road back became a nightmare.
Every mile was more dangerous than the last. By the time the exhausted British soldiers finally reached Boston, hundreds had been killed or wounded. The rebellion Britain thought it could crush in a single day had become a full-scale war. But even now, many people still hoped peace was possible. Surely the king would negotiate. Surely someone would stop the bloodshed. They were wrong. Because over the next year, something remarkable happened.
The colonies stopped asking for fair treatment. They stopped asking for lower taxes. They stopped asking for compromise. Now, they wanted something far more dangerous. Complete independence. Not better laws, not better rulers. Freedom. The kind of freedom that could only be won by defeating the most powerful empire on Earth. And in the summer of 1776, a group of ordinary men would gather in Philadelphia to make a decision that would change history forever.
By the summer of 1776, the war had already begun. Men had died. Families had been torn apart. Entire towns had been changed forever. But strangely, the colonies still weren't fighting for independence, not officially. Most people still hoped there was a way to repair the relationship with Britain. They believed the king might listen. They believed peace was still possible. They were wrong. Every letter sent to London was ignored. Every battle pushed the colonies further away from the crown.
Eventually, the question was no longer, how do we fix this? It became, how do we leave? In Philadelphia, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered inside a single room. The doors were closed. The discussions were secret. Outside, life continued as normal. People walked the streets, merchants sold their goods, children played.
But inside that room, the future of an entire continent was being decided. The debate lasted for days. Some delegates believed independence was the only path forward. Others thought it was complete madness. Are we really going to declare war on the greatest empire on Earth? It was a fair question. Britain had the world's most powerful navy, a professional army, unlimited resources compared to the colonies. But colonies had courage. But courage alone doesn't win wars. Then, a young lawyer from Virginia was asked to do something extraordinary. His name was Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't asked to lead an army. He wasn't asked to fight. He was asked to write. Not just a document, but a declaration that would explain to the world why these colonies believed they deserved to be free. Jefferson locked himself inside a small rented room. For days, he wrote in silence. Sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph. Sometimes he stopped, crossed out entire pages, and started again. Because he understood something very important. If these words failed to inspire people, the revolution might fail with them. Finally, the first draft was complete. The delegates gathered around the document. Every line was examined. Every sentence debated. Some words were removed. Others were rewritten. Nothing was accepted without discussion. Because they all understood one thing. Once these words became public, there would be no turning back. Then came July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was officially approved. It announced something the world had never heard before. That governments receive their power from the people. Not from kings, not from birth, not from bloodlines, but from the consent of those they govern. It was a revolutionary idea. One that would inspire movements around the world for generations to come.
Then came the moment that changed everything. The signatures. One by one, the delegates stepped forward. Some were wealthy businessmen. Some were lawyers. Some were farmers. Many had wives, children, and successful lives waiting for them at home. They all understood the consequences. If Britain crushed the revolution, they wouldn't be arrested. They wouldn't be fined. They would be executed for treason. Everything they owned could be taken. Their families could lose everything. And yet, they signed. One name, then another, then another. By the time the last signature was placed on the document, there was no turning back. America had declared itself free. But declaring freedom was the easy part. Now, they had to survive. Because across the Atlantic, the British Empire was already preparing its response. Thousands of soldiers were boarding ships. Warships were crossing the ocean. The king had no intention of accepting defeat. The biggest battle was still ahead. The Declaration had been signed. America had declared its independence. But declaring freedom and defending it were two very different things. The British Empire was furious. More ships crossed the Atlantic. More soldiers landed on American soil. The message was clear. This rebellion would be crushed. And at first, it looked like Britain was right. The Continental Army kept retreating. City after city fell into British hands. Many soldiers had no uniforms. Some had no blankets. Others had no shoes. Food was running out. Gunpowder was running low. Hope was beginning to disappear. By the winter of 1777, Washington's army reached Valley Forge. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a test of survival. The freezing cold was relentless. Disease spread through the camp. Hunger became an everyday enemy. Some soldiers wrapped rags around their bleeding feet. Others slept on the frozen ground. Many would never leave Valley Forge alive. From a distance, the revolution looked finished. Even some supporters believed it was only a matter of time before Britain won. But they underestimated one thing: the determination of people fighting for a future they had chosen themselves. Then, the war changed. France saw an opportunity to weaken its greatest rival. It decided to support the American cause. Money arrived. Weapons arrived. Experienced soldiers arrived. And perhaps most importantly, the French Navy arrived. For the first time, Britain was no longer fighting a small rebellion. It was fighting an international war. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Then came the moment that changed everything. The town of Yorktown. The autumn of 1781. American and French forces surrounded the British army. Escape by land was impossible. Escape by sea was impossible. The British were trapped. General Charles Cornwallis had only one choice left: surrender. When British soldiers laid down their weapons, the impossible became reality. The empire that had ruled across continent had been defeated by 13 colonies that only a few years earlier had never imagined becoming a nation. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The war was over. But the story was only beginning. Because the birth of the United States changed far more than the map of North America. It inspired revolutions. It influenced constitutions. It reshaped politics. And over the centuries, it became one of the most influential nations the world had ever seen. But here's the question that still fascinates historians today. What if Britain had won? Would there ever have been a United States of America? Would democracy have spread the same way? Would the world have become the one we know today?
No one can answer those questions. History gives us only one timeline, but one thing is certain. The 4th of July is more than a national holiday. It's the anniversary of one of history's greatest risks, a moment when ordinary people challenged extraordinary power, not because victory was guaranteed, but because they believed that freedom was worth the risk. Against all expectations, against all predictions, against the most powerful empire on earth, they won. And that victory didn't just create a new country, it changed the course of history forever.